The sky over the scrap heap was the color of rust and old bruises. The sun was a weak, white hole in a haze, giving little light and no warmth. Below, the ground was a mess of broken rock and twisted metal. The air smelled of dust, oil, and things left to rot for a long, long time. This was not a world people came to by choice. It was a world they were left on, or where they ran out of luck. In the middle of all this junk, people survived. They had built a small enclave, a collection of shelters made from old ship parts and scrap metal. It was a sad, patchwork place, but it was home. The leader here was a woman named Captain Sue. Her face was lined from years of hard decisions, and her eyes were hard like the metal she walked on. She was not a gentle woman, but she was fair, and she kept her people alive. Today was an important day. It was the day of the tithe. Every year, a ship came from the stars. It belonged to the Cathar, a powerful alien people. They were strong, advanced, and saw the humans of the scrap heap as little more than insects. But useful insects. The tithe was their way of collecting the most useful workers. They would take a few humans back to their worlds, promising them a better life, more food, a clean bed, a purpose. For many in the enclave, it was the only hope of escaping the dust and the decay. Two children watched from the shadows of a fallen support beam. The boy was Gene, thin and wiry, with sharp eyes that saw everything. He was maybe 13, but he carried himself like someone much older. His clothes were patched and too big for him. His hand was tied around his sister's smaller one. His sister was Mina. She was 9, small for her age, with a quietness that made her seem like a ghost sometimes. She rarely spoke, and her large eyes were always watching, always taking things in. She clung to Jin's side, her trust in him the one solid thing in her world. "Do we have to watch, Jin?" Mina whispered, her voice barely a breath. "We have to see who they take," Jin said, his voice low. He wasn't planning to be chosen. He had no special skills they would want. He was just a good scavenger, good at finding useful bits in the junk. But his only real job, the one he had given himself when their parents were gone, was to protect Mina. He watched the landing zone with a hunter's focus, looking for any sign of danger. Then, the ship came down. It slid down through the dirty clouds without a sound. It was nothing like the broken human vessels that littered the landscape. This ship was sleek and smooth, shaped like a dark, wet seed. It was beautiful and terrifying all at once. It settled on the ground with a soft hiss, its metal cool and perfect. The ramp extended from its side, and the Cathar emerged. There were 3 of them. They were huge, each one taller and broader than the biggest man in the enclave. They wore armor that seemed to be part of their bodies, dark gray and covered in subtle patterns. Their faces were hidden behind smooth helmets, with only a dark, multi-lensed eyepiece to see out of. They moved with a heavy, powerful grace that said they owned the ground they walked on. The one in front was the biggest. This was Kale. He moved to the front of the small group and stood before Captain Sue. He didn't bother with greetings. "The tithe is due," a flat, mechanical voice said from a speaker on his chest. "Present your candidates." Captain Sue stood her ground, her back straight. "The terms are the same. Service for a better life." "The terms are what the Cathar Imperium says they are," Kale's translated voice replied. It was impossible to tell if there was any emotion behind it. "Your people will be scanned. Those with useful biological signatures or technical aptitude will be taken. You should be grateful for our interest." Sue's jaw tightened, but she gave a sharp nod to the small group of men and women she had gathered. They were the best scavengers, the best mechanics, the strongest workers. They stepped forward, hope and fear mixed on their tired faces. Kale and the other 2 Cathar began to walk down the line. One of them held a small device that glowed with a soft green light. They passed it over each person. The device would beep once or stay silent. A beep meant you were interesting. Silence meant you were staying. Gene watched from his hiding spot, his body tense. He saw the way Kale looked at the humans. It wasn't the way a person looks at another person. It was the way a miner looks at a rock, checking to see if there's any valuable or inside point one by one. The Cathar moved down the line. A young man who was good with electronics got a beep. A strong woman who could lift heavy engine parts got a beep. They looked relieved and scared. Those who were passed over looked down at the ground, their shoulders slumping. Then, something strange happened. The Kthar with the scanner was almost at the end of the line when the device let out a sudden, sharp series of beeps. It wasn't the single, confirming sound from before. This was a frantic, excited chirping. The Kthar soldier stopped and looked at the device, then turned his helmeted head toward the crowd of onlookers, not the candidates. Kale noticed the change. "What is it?" his voice boomed. The soldier pointed the device away from the line and toward the shadows where Jean and Mina were hiding. The chirping grew faster, more insistent. The green light on the scanner glowed brightly. A latent psionic signature, Commander Kale, the soldier reported. Powerful, untrained, coming from that one. The dark lens of Kale's helmet focused directly on Mina. Jin's blood ran cold. He pulled Mina tighter behind the beam, but it was too late. They had been seen. A latent, Kale repeated, the word sounding hungry even through the emotionless translator. He took a heavy step away from the line of candidates and started walking toward the two children. The Imperium has a great use for such ones. Their potential is valuable. Captain Sue moved to block his path. Wait, she's just a child. She is not part of the tithe. She is now, Kale said, and he simply brushed past her as if she weren't there. His focus was entirely on Mina. Mina began to tremble. She pressed herself against Jin's back, her small fingers clutching his worn jacket. A low, frightened whimper escaped her lips. "Leave her alone," Jean shouted, his voice cutting through the tense air. He stepped out from behind the beam, putting himself squarely between the giant alien and his sister. Kale stopped. He looked down at the scrawny boy standing defiantly in his path. A low, guttural sound came from his helmet, a native Kthar sound the translator didn't need to process. It was a sound of pure contempt. "You obscure a valuable resource, insect," the mechanical voice stated. "Step aside or be stepped on." Jin's heart was hammering so hard he could feel it in his throat. His palms were sweaty, but his feet were planted firmly in the dust. He saw Kale's massive, three-fingered hand, covered in hard armor, reach out. It wasn't reaching for him. It was reaching past him. For Mina, in that moment, Jin's fear vanished, replaced by a cold, clear certainty. He reached to his belt and drew his spear. The spear was not much to look at. It was a length of scavenged metal rod, about as long as Jin's arm. One end was wrapped in rough cloth for a grip. The other end had been sharpened against stones for countless hours until it had a fine, wicked point. It was a tool for prying, for testing unstable ground, and for protection against the sharp-toothed creatures that sometimes crawled out of the deeper junk piles. Now, it was the only thing standing between a Kthar warrior and his sister. Jean did not think. His body moved with a desperate speed born from a lifetime of surviving in a dangerous place. As Kale's large, armored hand reached past him for Mina, Jean lunged. He did not scream or yell. He put all his weight, all his fear, all his love for his sister into that one sharp movement. He knew he could not pierce the main armor on Kale's chest or back. He was a scavenger. He looked for weaknesses, for cracks, for the soft places things broke. His eyes had seen the narrow gap between the bottom of Kale's smooth helmet and the top of his chest plate. It was a complex joint, a place where wires and tubes had to be. It was a vulnerability. The point of the small spear aimed true for that tiny G-8P that the T never landed. With a speed that was shocking for something so large, Kale's other hand snapped up. He did not even look at the spear. He simply closed his armored fingers around the metal shaft just inches from his throat, stopping Jin's thrust dead. The impact jarred Jin's arm all the way to his shoulder. It felt like he had tried to stab a solid rock. Kale held the spear, unmoving. He looked from the weapon in his grip to the boy holding the other end. The dark lens of his helmet gave nothing away. "A stick," the flat, translated voice said. The word was filled with more mockery than any tone could convey. "You threaten me with a stick." He tightened his grip. There was a sharp, screeching sound of metal being crushed. The high-tensile alloy rod, which Jean had worked on for so long, twisted and then snapped in Kale's hand. The broken piece, still gripped by the alien, was crumpled like soft paper. Jean stared, stunned, at the broken end of his spear. It was now just a jagged shard in his hand. This was his best weapon, his only real possession of value. And the alien had destroyed it without any effort at all. Before Jean could even process this, Kale moved. It was not a fighting move. It was a dismissive one, like a man swatting a fly. He swung the arm that had blocked the spear in a short, brutal arc. The back of his armored hand connected with Jin's chest. The air exploded from Jin's lungs. A sharp, cracking pain bloomed in his ribs. The world spun around him, a blur of rusty ground and gray sky. He flew backwards, landing hard in the dust several feet away. The impact knocked what little breath he had left out of him. He lay there, gasping, his vision swimming. The taste of blood filled his mouth from where he had bitten his lip. A high, terrified scream cut through the air. It was Mina. Jin's head swam, but he forced his eyes to focus. He saw Kale, having completely forgotten about him, turn his full attention to Mina. The giant alien took one heavy step toward the crying girl. "Do not be afraid." Kale's voice boomed, the words a horrible lie. "You will serve a greater purpose than this filth." Mina was frozen in place, her back against the cold metal of the support beam. Her eyes were wide with pure terror, fixed on the monster approaching her. She was shaking so hard her whole small body trembled. "Leave her alone." The voice was Captain Seuss. She had drawn her own weapon, a heavy wrench made from ship-grade steel. She stood firm, her face a mask of fury. "You got your people. The girl is not part of the deal. You will not take her." Kale stopped and slowly turned his head toward her. The other two Kthar soldiers immediately raised their weapons. They were strange, blocky devices that hummed with a low, dangerous energy. "You would break the agreement, human?" Kale asked. "Your entire enclave survives on the goods we leave for the tithe. Would you have them all starve for one useless child?" Sue's knuckles were white on the wrench. She looked from Kale to the terrified Mina, to the faces of her people. She saw their fear, their desperation. She was their leader. Her job was to keep them all alive, not to start a war they could not win. The struggle on her face was a terrible thing to see. The wrench in her hand lowered, just a little. Kale saw it. He made that low, guttural sound of satisfaction again. He turned back to Mina. Jean pushed himself up on his elbows. Every breath was a stab of pain in his chest. He coughed, spitting red dust and blood onto the ground. He saw Kale reaching for his sister again. He saw Captain Sue standing helpless. He saw the other humans looking down or looking away, unable to help. He was the only one. He was always the only one for Mina. His fingers closed around what was left of his spear. The broken end was about the length of his forearm, sharp and jagged where it had snapped. It was even smaller now, more useless than before. But it was all he had. He tried to get to his feet, but his legs were weak and the world tilted. He could only manage to get to his knees. The dust clung to his sweaty skin and the blood on his lip. He was hurt. He was small. He was nobody. But he was not done. Kale's large hand closed around Mina's thin arm. Her crying stopped, replaced by a silent, open-mouthed horror. The moment he touched her, something changed in the it was not a sound. It was a feeling. A wave of pure, cold fear washed out from Mina. It was so strong, it was almost a physical thing. The humans in the crowd flinched, looking around with sudden, unexplained anxiety. One of the Kthar soldiers shifted his weight, his helmet tilting as if he had heard a strange noise. Their sensitive systems were picking up the raw, psychic energy leaking from her terror. It was just a flicker, a momentary spike, but it was enough of a distraction. Kale focused on his prize, felt it too. His head tilted slightly, a gesture of curiosity. For one single second, his attention was not on the boy he had just thrown aside like garbage. That was the second Jean needed that he did not get to his feet. He did not charge. He used the last of his strength to push forward from his knees, scrambling through the dust like an animal. He was not aiming for the giant's back. He was not trying a heroic leap. He was moving low and fast, under the radar of the alien's attention, directly toward the massive legs. Kale began to turn, a low growl of annoyance starting in his throat. The insect was still buzzing. As Kale turned, the vulnerable spot at the front of his throat was exposed for just a moment. It was a complex assembly of layered plates, meant to allow for movement and speech. It was the strongest part of his neck armor, but it was still a joint. And all joints have weak points. Gene, from his low position on the ground, saw his chance. It was the only chance he would get. He gripped the broken spear shard. He did not hold it like a knife for stabbing. He held it like a spike to be driven upward with all the force he had left. He put the last of his will, his last breath, his entire life into one final, desperate movement. He drove the sharp, broken point upward, aiming for the center of that armored throat joint. The world seemed to slow down. The only thing that existed was the path of the broken metal shard in Jin's hand. It was a small, final, hopeless act. He expected it to shatter against the alien armor, or to be batted away at the last second. It did not shatter. There was a terrible sound, a hard, grinding pop followed by a sharp hiss of escaping air. The spear tip, sharpened by 1,000 careful strokes on stone, did not pierce the main armor, but it found the narrow seam between two of the layered plates. The force of Jin's thrust, driven by desperation, jammed the shard deep into the complex machinery of Kale's neck seal. For a moment, nothing happened. Jin stayed there, kneeling, his arm extended, the jagged piece of metal buried in the giant's throat. He waited for the killing blow. Then, Kale made a sound. It was not the flat, mechanical voice from the translator. It was a raw, wet, choking rasp that came from inside his helmet. It was a sound of pure, shocked agony. His body stiffened. The hand that was holding Mina's arm went limp, releasing her. She stumbled back, falling into the dust, but she was free. Kale's own hands, those massive, armored fists, came up to his neck. They clawed at the metal fragment sticking out from under his helmet. He tried to grab it, to pull out, but his thick fingers could not get a good grip on the small, embedded shard. A gurgling, static-filled noise bubbled from his speaker, mixed with the hiss of leaking fluids and pressurized air. He took a stumbling step backward. Then another. His balance, once so sure and powerful, was gone. The systems in his suit that helped him move, that regulated his air, were damaged. With a heavy, ground-shaking thud, he dropped to one knee. His body swayed. The terrifying giant was brought low. Silence fell over the landing zone. It was a thick, heavy silence, broken only by Kale's ragged, struggling breaths and the continuous, faint hiss from his neck. The other two Kthar soldiers stood frozen, their weapons still raised, but they did not fire. They were in shock. They had never seen a Kthar commander fall. They had certainly never seen one brought down by a human child with a piece of scrap metal. The humans were just as stunned. They stared at the kneeling giant and the small, battered boy still kneeling before him. Captain Seuss' wrench hung forgotten in her hand. Her mouth was slightly open. She had seen bravery before, but this was something else. This was not bravery. This was something primal. This was the will of an orphan protecting the only family he had left, and it fell to God that Jin's body screamed with pain. His chest felt like it was on fire with every breath. He could taste the iron-rich blood in his mouth. He was dizzy and weak, but he saw that Kale was down, not dead. He saw the alien's hands fumbling at his throat. He saw the other soldiers who could still decide to kill him and Mina and everyone else. The fight was not over. Slowly, painfully, Gene pushed himself to his feet. He stood on shaky legs, swaying slightly in the dusty wind. He never took his eyes off Kale. He reached slowly to his belt, to a hidden pocket sewn into the inside of his pants. From it, he pulled out another piece of metal. This one was even smaller than the broken spear. It was a thin, flat sliver of the same alloy, about the length of his palm. He had found it long ago, the sharpest piece of shrapnel he had ever seen. He had kept it for a true emergency, for when all other hope was lost. He held it now between his thumb and forefinger. It was not a weapon for fighting. It was a weapon for killing. He took a step forward, then another, until he was standing right in front of the kneeling Kale. The alien was still much taller than him, even on one knee. Kale's dark lens focused on him, and for the first time, Gene thought he saw something in that blank surface. Not anger, not even pain. It was confusion. The utter confusion of the impossible happening. Jin's voice was rough from the dust and the damage to his chest. It was not loud. It did not need to be. In the absolute silence, every word was clear. He did not speak to the crowd. He did not speak to Captain Sue. He spoke only to Kale. "Touch my sister, human," he said. He used the old word. The word from Earth. The word that defined them, not as scavengers or victims, but as people. On his lips, it was not a name. It was a warning. It was a title that he raised a small, sharp sliver of metal. He did not point it at Kale's eyes or his heart. He pointed it at the same spot on his throat, right next to the piece of spear that was still buried there. "And you will not rise again." The meaning of the words was clear. It was not a threat to win the fight. It was a promise. It was a vow that if Kale tried to get up, if he tried to touch Mina again, Gene would use this last, tiny piece of metal to finish the job. He would make sure the giant never stood up. He would make sure the giant never breathed again. He would give his own life to make that happen. It was the cold, simple logic of a scrap heap. Some fights are not about winning. They're about making sure the other person loses completely. Kale stared at the boy. He heard the words. He saw the absolute certainty in Jin's eyes. This was not a bluff. The boy was ready to die here, in the dust, to keep his promise. The Kthar respected strength above all else. They understood power and dominance. But this was a different kind of strength. This was not the strength of muscles or weapons. This was the strength of a will that could not be broken. It was a strength that, in its own way, was more terrifying than their own. Kale's hands slowly fell away from his injured neck. He stopped trying to pull the metal out. He remained on his knee, his great head bowed slightly. The fight had gone out of him. He had been defeated, not just by a weapon, but by a spirit he could not comprehend. The standoff was broken by a new voice. "Lower your weapons." The command came from the ramp of the alien ship. Another Kthar stood there. This one was slightly less massive than Kale, and his armor had different, more subtle markings. This was Ambassador Valen. He had been observing from the ship, and now he walked down the ramp with a calm, measured pace. He looked at the scene before him. His commander on his knees, a human boy standing over him with a shard of metal, and a terrified girl in the dust. He looked at Gene. Then he looked at Mina, who was now watching everything with wide, silent eyes. He looked at the broken spear in Kale's neck. He walked until he was standing a few feet from Gene. He did not look at Kale. "The boy," Valen said, his translated voice calm and clear. "What is your name?" The ambassador's question hung in the air. For a long moment, Gene did not answer. His entire world had narrowed to the kneeling giant and the sharp metal in his hand. The voice was an intrusion from a place he had forgotten. He slowly turned his head, his eyes still hard and cold, to look at the new alien. "Gene," he said, his voice a dry rasp. He did not lower the metal shard. Ambassador Valen gave a single, slow nod of his helmet. He looked at Gene not with anger or contempt, but with a deep, calculating interest. He then turned his gaze to Mina, who had slowly gotten to her feet. She was staring at her brother, her small face pale, but her eyes were no longer full of terror. They were full of a fierce, shining pride. "And the girl is your sister," Valen stated. It was not a question. "Yes," Gene said, the word a clear warning. Valen looked back at Kale, who remained on his knee, a low, pained gurgle still coming from his damaged neck unit. Commander Kale acted outside his authority. He saw a resource and sought to take it by force. This is not the way of the tithe. It is not the way of the Kthar Imperium. His words were for everyone, but his focus was on Gene and Captain Sue. Captain Sue finally found her voice. She stepped forward, her wrench still in her hand, though it was no longer raised as a weapon. "You call this a way? You call attacking a child a way?" Her voice was tight with controlled anger. "It was his way," Valen replied calmly. "A way of greed and blunt force. It is a way that has now failed him." He gestured to the two soldiers. "Take Commander Kale to the med bay aboard the ship. See to his injuries." The soldiers hesitated for a second, then moved to obey. They approached their fallen commander carefully. One of them pulled a small tool from his belt and carefully cut the protruding piece of the spear shard, leaving the embedded part in place for the medics to handle. They then each took one of Kale's arms and helped him to his feet. He was unsteady, his great weight leaning on them. As they led him away, his dark lens fixed on Jean for one last moment. There was no anger there now. There was only a kind of stunned, humiliated shock. Jean watched them go, his body still tense. He did not lower his shard of metal until Kale had disappeared inside the dark opening of the ship. Only then did his arm slowly fall to his side. The sudden release of tension made him sway on his feet. The pain in his chest flared, and he coughed, wincing. Mina was at his side in an instant. She did not say anything. She just slipped her small hand into his free one and held on tightly. Her presence was a warm anchor in the dizzying aftermath. Valen now turned to address the whole crowd. His voice was loud and clear. The Kthar respect strength. We measure it in many forms. The strength of a warrior, the strength of a builder, the strength of a leader. He paused, letting his words sink in. Then he pointed an armored finger at Jean, and the strength of will, the strength to stand against the impossible to protect what is yours. This is a strength the Imperium has forgotten. Today, we have been reminded. He looked at the faces of the humans, at their confusion and their fear. The old tithe is ended. We do not need more servants who follow without question. We have enough of those. He then turned back to Jean and Mina. A new kind of strength is required. A spirit that cannot be broken. A loyalty that cannot be bought. You, he said to Jean, and your sister will come with us. A murmur ran through the crowd. Captain Sue took a step forward. You would take them as prisoners? As payment for your wounded pride? No, Valen said, and the word was firm. Not as prisoners, not as servants. They will be students. They will be taught. The boy's spirit will be trained, not crushed. The girl's latent talent will be guided, not exploited. They will learn of the stars, and we will learn from them. Jean looked down at Mina. Her eyes were wide, looking from the ambassador to the massive starship. He could feel her hand trembling in his. This was too big, too fast. His whole life had been about surviving the next day, finding the next meal, keeping Mina safe in their small, dirty world. The stars were not a dream for him. They were just lights in the sky. What choice do we have? Jean asked, his voice quiet but firm. He was not asking Captain Sue. He was asking Valen. Valen understood the question. You have the only choice that matters. You can say no. You and your sister can stay here in the dust. You can live the life you have always known. We will leave, and the tithe will not happen again. Your people will have to find a new way to survive without our trade. He let the weight of that choice settle on Jin's young shoulders. It was a terrible burden. If he said no, he protected Mina from the unknown, but he might be condemning his entire community to a slower, harder death without the resources the tithe provided. If he said yes, he was stepping into a world of aliens and starships, a world where he had no control, all on the promise of a creature who had just watched him injure one of their own. Captain, Sue looked at Jean. Her hard face was unreadable. The choice is yours, Jean, she said. You have earned that much. No one here will blame you, whatever you decide. All eyes were on him, the orphan boy who had changed everything. He looked at Mina. What do you think? He whispered to her. Mina looked up at the huge, silent ship. Then she looked at the rusty, broken world around them. She looked at the faces of the people, thin and tired. Finally, she looked at her brother's face, at the cut on his lip and the pain in his eyes. You kept me safe here, she whispered back, her voice so soft only he could hear it. You will keep me safe there, too. That was all he needed to hear. Her trust was his compass. It had always been that he lifted his head and looked at Ambassador Valen. He stood a little straighter, ignoring the pain in his chest. We will go, Jean said that a slow breath seemed to go through the crowd. It was not a sound of celebration. It was a sound of awe and of fear for what this would mean. Valen gave another nod. It is decided. He gestured toward the ramp. You may bring any possessions you wish to carry. Jean looked down at the piece of sharp metal still in his hand. It was his last weapon. He looked at the broken shaft of his spear, lying in the dust near where Kale had fallen. He walked over to it and picked it up. He looked at Captain Sue. "Take care of them," he said to her. It was not a request from a child to an adult. It was an instruction from one protector to another. Captain Sue nodded, a deep respect in her eyes. "I will." Jean turned. Holding the broken spear in one hand and Mina's hand in the other, he walked toward the ramp. He did not look back at the scrap heap. He did not look back at the only home he had ever known. His eyes were fixed forward on the dark, open doorway of the starship. Mina walked beside him, her small steps matching his. Together, the two orphans, with nothing but a broken piece of scrap in each other, stepped out of the dust and into the stars. The inside of the alien ship was a different world. The air was cool and clean, with no taste of dust. The light came from soft panels in the walls and ceiling, casting no shadows. The floors were smooth and seamless. After the rough, broken landscape of the scrap heap, it felt like walking into a dream or a trap. Jean held Mina's hand tightly. His whole body was a storm of pain and adrenaline. Every breath was a sharp reminder of Kale's blow. He kept the broken spear shaft in his other hand, his knuckles white around it. It was the only familiar thing he had left. Mina was quiet, her eyes wide as she took in the strange, clean corridors. She did not seem afraid anymore, just deeply curious. She kept close to her brother, her small presence a comfort to him. Ambassador Valen led them through the ship without speaking. They passed other Kthar, who stopped and moved aside for the ambassador. Their dark lenses followed the two small humans. Jean could feel their gaze, but he met it with a hard look of his own. He would not show weakness here. They entered a small room with a soft bench and a table that seemed to be made of light. "Sit," Valen said. "A medical scan will be done. For your injuries," he added, looking at Jean that a moment later, a different kind of alien entered. It was smaller than the Kthar, with slender limbs and large, gentle eyes. It carried a device that glowed with a soft blue light. This was a medical technician. It gestured for Jean to sit on the bench. Jean hesitated, looking at Valen. "It will not harm you," Valen said. "Your strength is of no use to us if you die from a broken rib." Slowly, Jean sat down. The technician passed the blue light over his chest. A cool, soothing sensation spread through the area where the pain was worst. Jean felt the sharp edges of the pain begin to soften. The device hummed for a minute, and when it moved away, the terrible ache was gone. He could breathe deeply again. The cut on his lip was sealed, leaving only a faint trace of dried blood. The technician then turned to Mina. She shrank back against Jean. "It is okay," Jean said to her, his voice softer now. "It helps the pain." Mina allowed the technician to scan her. The blue light passed over her, and the device gave a series of soft, musical chimes. The technician looked at a small screen and then spoke to Valen in a series of clicks and whistles. Valen turned to the children. "The girl's potential is confirmed. It is very strong and very raw. It is what called to our scanner. It is a great gift, but it can also be a danger if it is not understood." "What kind of gift?" Jean asked, his protective instincts flaring again. "She feels what others feel," Valen explained. "Very strongly. Your fear, your anger, your love. It washes over her. On your world, with so few people, it was manageable. Here, in a crowd, or on a busy world, it could overwhelm her. We can teach her to control it, to build walls in her mind to protect herself." Jean looked at Mina. He thought about how she always seemed to know when he was sad or scared, even when he tried to hide it. He thought about the wave of terror that had washed over everyone when Kale grabbed her. It made a terrible kind of sense. He nodded slowly. "You will teach her. You will not hurt her." "That is the agreement," Valen said. He led them from the medical room to another part of the ship. This was a larger room with a wide, clear viewport. For the first time, Jean and Mina saw the stars not as little lights, but as a brilliant, endless sea of suns. Their own world, the scrap heap, was a small, brown, and ugly ball hanging in the blackness below them. It looked lonely and sad. Jean stared at it. That was his whole life down there. All the struggle, all the dust, all the hunger. It was so small. He felt a strange, pull in his chest. It was not a desire to go back. It was the realization of how tiny his world had been. Mina pressed her face to the cool transparency. "It's so big," she whispered. "This is only the beginning," Valen said from behind them. "There are worlds with green skies and purple oceans. Worlds with cities that touch the clouds. You will see them all." "Why?" Jean asked, turning from the view. His voice was not grateful. It was suspicious. "Why us? Why do this?" Valen was silent for a moment, as if choosing his words carefully. "The Cthar Imperium is strong. We have conquered many worlds. Our technology is advanced. Our warriors are without equal. But we have grown stale. We follow rules. We seek efficiency. We have forgotten how to be unexpected." He looked at Jean, and for a moment, the formality in his voice faded. "What you did today was not efficient. It was not according to any rule. It was a hopeless act that should have failed, but did not fail, because you did not care about the rules of the fight. You only cared about the result. That is a spirit we have lost. That is a spirit we need to remember. The universe is a dangerous place. Sometimes you do not need a perfect warrior. You need a boy with a spear who will not back down." The ship began to move. The brown planet slowly started to shrink, becoming a distant, and then vanishing entirely into the sea of stars. They were truly gone. Jean felt a finality then. A door had closed behind them. There was no going back. The life of the scavenger was over. He looked down at the broken spear in his hand. It was just a piece of junk now, a memory of a place he had left behind. He walked over to a small disposal unit set into the wall. He held the spear over the opening. He thought about all the hours he had spent sharpening it, all the times it had kept him safe. It was part of him, but he was not that boy anymore that he let go. The broken shaft fell into the unit and was gone. He turned back to Mina and took her hand again. She looked up at him, and he saw the reflection of 1,000 stars in her eyes. He was not a scavenger anymore. He was not sure what he was, but he knew what he had to do. He had to learn. He had to become strong in this new, big world. He had to be ready for whatever happened next. He had to keep his promise, not just to stop a Cthar warrior, but to always protect his sister. The ship flew on into the deep, silent black. The two orphans from a world of dust stood together, watching their future rush toward them. They were small, and they were alone, but they were not afraid. They had each other, and for now, that was enough.